Well, greetings, friends. My name is JT. I'm one of the pastors here at The Well, and this is the last installment of our Extremists for Love sermon series. I was supposed to preach this sermon a few weeks ago, and I fell ill, but now I'm back, and I'm feeling much better, and I'm happy to be here with you to bring this last message. We spent the month of July looking back at the history of racism in St. Louis, and talking about how our faith calls us to respond as extremists for love, a term Martin Luther King Jr. used in his letter from the Birmingham jail. And in case you weren't with us up until this point in the series, or in case you haven't seen the other few sermons, we spent our first week together talking about the murder of Michael Brown and the Ferguson uprising. We spent our second week talking about Dred Scott and what I call the irony of the old St. Louis courthouse. And in the final week, we talked about the 1917 East St. Louis race massacre, an event of racial injustice largely lost in our collective memory. And before we really jump into our final installment of this series, I just want to take a second and thank you all for allowing me to have these conversations with you for several weeks. Preaching this series has at once been emotionally and spiritually and intellectually exhausting, but also life-giving and challenging and fruitful in ways that I never would have expected. And I know I'm not alone in that. The things we've been talking about are frank and weighty, and I don't want to take for granted that you all have kept showing up week after week ready to learn and engage in new and challenging ways. So thank you so much for that. And I know that while the content of the series may have been helpful to you to learn some new things about the history of St. Louis and the way that they're connected to your faith, but you may be wondering what the real point of this series has been. Yes, it's tied up in my doctoral research, but besides that, what's the point of me standing up here and telling all of these stories? What's my hope for you? Well, like I said, I hope you've learned some new things. You've been challenged to think in new ways, but that's not all. I told my research group a few weeks ago as we were sitting down and chatting in one of our post-sermon discussions, and you may have all picked up on this by now, but I'm trying to kind of do this Mr. Miyagi thing here. Yes, you're showing up each week and you're hearing me share these stories and these histories and talk about the way our faith calls us to respond, but none of that matters if you don't know how to keep doing it once this series is done. So I hope you've all gleaned some tools that you can use to interrogate received histories, ask critical questions about concentrations of power, and examine the ways that race has shaped the world around us for yourselves. I'm always happy to keep bringing fish to the table to help feed people, but my real passion is helping people learn how to fish for themselves. So the next time you're driving in St. Louis and you're driving down a street like, I don't know, Del Mar Boulevard, you notice how one side of the street is thriving and the other side of the street is struggling, and you have the skills and knowledge to ask why. And speaking of, yes, today we are talking about Del Mar Boulevard. More specifically, the racial and economic disparities between the neighborhoods north of Del Mar and the neighborhoods south of Del Mar. This phenomenon has come to be known as the Del Mar Divide. And it's the residual effects of over 100 years of racist and segregationist efforts in St. Louis. And we can't talk about that without talking about redlining. Now, a lot of you may have heard of redlining before. It's this practice of denying services, especially loans and mortgages, to certain geographic areas populated by certain races and ethnicities. Right? The term redlining comes from these maps that were created by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, a government agency created during the New Deal era. This corporation created maps for over 200 major cities in the U.S. and color-coded them according to how risky mortgages would be there, ranging from green, or very good, to red, or hazardous, hence the name redlining. Here's the catch though. The red or hazardous areas were all in disproportionately black neighborhoods. So banks and mortgage lenders were far less likely to work with people in those areas to buy homes or start businesses because they were told it would be too risky. Now, if you were to look at the map of St. Louis and draw a little dotted line along Del Mar Boulevard, you'd see that in the early 30s when these maps were drawn, most of the red areas are downtown by the riverfront, with several red areas being north of Del Mar, whereas the great majority of the green areas are below Del Mar. If you think back to one of our first weeks in this series, we talked a lot about the Mill Creek Valley neighborhood, this predominantly black neighborhood in downtown St. Louis. It was destroyed to make way for corporate buildings and the highway. That area was redlined and zoned as hazardous, and it eventually was bulldozed over in the name of urban renewal. And that trend only continues over the course of St. Louis's history because of communities coming together and forming racial covenants, right? These agreements that if a neighborhood was 75% white or more, they could not sell to non-whites, and practices like racial steering, where real estate agents would consciously steer black clients away from predominantly white neighborhoods and to predominantly black ones. St. Louis remains, to this day, one of the most segregated cities in America. Now, in case you're having a hard time kind of conceptualizing how pervasive this all is, let me throw out some numbers to you. Hang in with me for a minute, I promise this is going to be helpful. On the eastern side of Del Mar, there are two neighborhoods. One of them is 1/2 mile north of Del Mar, the other is 1/2 mile south of Del Mar. Up north, we have the Fountain Park neighborhood. Down south, we have the Central West End. Demographically, Fountain Park is overwhelmingly black at about 90%, while the Central West End is majority white, around 60%. Median home value in Fountain Park is right around $65,000, while the median home price of the Central West End is nearly $350,000. Majority black and north of Del Mar, inexpensive, depreciated, rundown housing. Majority white south of Del Mar, expensive, high-value housing. Now, you may see that and think, well, maybe this is only a housing issue, or maybe that's something that really only happens that far downtown. But the same thing happens on the western, much less urban side of Del Mar. Let's look at some numbers concerning public education in both Clayton, south of Del Mar, and Normandy, north of Del Mar. Clayton High School is 63% white. It spends about $18,000 per student annually, and has only about 8% of their students enrolled in the free and reduced lunch program. Now compare that to Normandy High School, the high school where Michael Brown graduated from, by the way, where the students are 93% black. They can only spend about $9,000 per student, and 99% of the students are on the free and reduced lunch program. These schools are only 5 miles apart from each other. Fountain Park and Central West End are only 1 mile apart from each other, and yet the people who live in each of these areas have overwhelmingly different life experiences. The city in which many of us were born and raised and live and work was very intentionally designed around the idea that certain people should be disconnected from access to wealth and privilege and power. And there are a lot of people, especially here in America, that point to things like wealth and privilege and power as a kind of divine reward for faithfulness. This is called the prosperity gospel. It's the idea that if you're faithful and you pray really hard and you give money to the church and you do everything your pastor says, you will prosper financially, socially, whatever. And if you're not faithful in those ways, you'll be underprivileged and impoverished. Now, think about what happens when we superimpose that onto a society that was only ever designed for white people to prosper. A society that was only ever designed to afford wealth and privilege and power to white people, and poverty and disadvantage and vulnerability to black people. What happens is that things like segregation and economic oppression and racial injustice become legitimized and sanctioned in God's name. What does that theology have to say to Michael Brown's mother as she stood on Canfield Drive dropping rose petals onto the blood-stained ground where her son was murdered? Do her prayers not matter? What does it have to say to Dred Scott and his family when the American justice system denied them freedom? Or to the victims of the East St. Louis massacre when they were being mindlessly killed by a white mob? It says that there is a chasm with the poor and oppressed and black and brown on one side and God and white people on the other. And no matter how hard you pray or how much money you give or how hard you try to be faithful, it can never be bridged. And I can't think of a more corrupt, cheap, diluted, unbiblical gospel to preach in this world, because there is nothing, I'll say it again, nothing that can come between God's love and God's people. Any separation that may have ever existed between us and God was obliterated in the life and death and resurrection of Christ. And yet our city, the roads and the buildings and the neighborhoods that surround us every day was designed to do nothing but manufacture separation, to put distance between people and dignity, people and justice, people and liberation, people and love. In Romans 8, Paul asked the question, who will separate us from the love of Christ? Will hardship or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or sword? The answer is no. None of those will separate people from the love of Christ, but that doesn't change the fact that throughout history there have been countless people who would sit in churches and acknowledge that on Sunday and then turn around and inflict all of those things on people on Monday. We can't look at the reality of the neighborhoods around Del Mar and not acknowledge the disparity between God's love for people and our lack thereof. No, hardship can't separate people from the love of God, but it can separate them from decent housing and quality education. The sword can't separate people from the love of God, but it can separate them from their loved ones when they're killed by the police or disappeared by the prison industrial complex and the American immigration system. Just because those things won't separate people from God's love doesn't mean they don't separate people from our love. What about our love? Shouldn't there be no separation between our love and our neighbor? Between our love and our world? And I've said this before, love is not just sentimentalism. This is where the thoughts and prayers politicians get it wrong. They assume love means thinking tenderly about people or praying to an old man in the sky fondly for people instead of actually doing something. Love is not an emotion, it's a verb. One of my intellectual mentors, Cornel West, once said that justice is what love looks like in public. If we love this city, we need to be working for justice. We need to be dismantling the racial and economic divides around us and demanding that the people in power be doing the same. Del Mar might just be a street in downtown St. Louis, but it's also the embodiment of this cosmic brokenness of the world, the tendency to persecute and oppress and tear others apart from the love and goodness that God desires for us. We have an opportunity here at the well to be a beacon of light, to hold authority accountable, to look at the current state of the city of St. Louis and to the surrounding area and say, no more of this. We want something different for this place, something that brings life and not death, liberation and not subjugation, justice and not brutality. And I hope we take those opportunities as many times as we can, in all the ways we can, for as long as we can, until the Lord lets us rest. Now, like I said at the beginning, this is the last sermon in our series. I'm sure you've all heard enough of me, and you're ready for this series to be over. But before I go, I have one last request. Please don't let this be the last time you engage in this stuff. Don't stop thinking about power or studying racism or trying to understand the history of our city and how our faith calls us to help make it better. And if I can, I want to leave you with a couple resource recommendations. First, if you want a deep dive into the history of St. Louis, pick up a copy of The Broken Heart of America, St. Louis and the Violent History of the United States by Walter Johnson. Johnson is from St. Louis. He teaches at Harvard now, and the book is an incredible dive into the history of our city and how this was often ground zero for things that ended up spreading nationwide. And second, I couldn't end this series without taking the opportunity to plug the book that started all of this. My book, Extremists for Love, a theological introduction to the struggle for racial justice in America. I published this book last August as a starting point for the conversation about race and faith, specifically in white churches. And it examines the life and work of 20 figures from American history, spanning from pre-Civil War to contemporary America. And now this is important, so please hear this. Over the last few decades, pastors have been embroiled in controversy for profiting off of book sales to their churches and church members. They would do stuff like we're doing right now. They would preach a sermon series and plug their book, and the whole time they'd be making money off of it. I think that's totally unethical and exploitative, and I don't want to be a part of it. So here's my promise to you. Every dollar I've made from the sale of my book in its first year, August 23rd, 2024 through August 23rd, 2025, is going to go directly to the well, to support our ministries here. Believe me, it's not going to be much, but it'll be something. So if you've already purchased a copy of Extremists for Love, or if you purchase one anytime between now and the end of August, any profit that would have normally come to me is going to go directly to the well. Again, it's been such a joy to have spent this time learning with you all, and I'm so grateful for it. This work isn't easy. Anti-racism is a train we never get off. Being an extremist for love is a decision and a journey we have to walk every day. But I'm thankful that it's a journey we get to walk together. Amen.